At 6:42 a.m. on November 15, 1944, Technical Sergeant Mike Sullivan crouched under the smoking hull of a disabled Sherman tank in the Hurtgen Forest, watching 8 German Panzers advance through the morning fog just 400 yards away. The 24-year-old mechanic from Detroit had been mocked by every tank crew for 6 weeks. They called his wire modification hillbilly engineering. His own commander said it was amateur-hour garbage that would get men killed. But in the next 12 minutes, Sullivan's stupid cable fix would prove unstoppable against German armor. Michael Sullivan had never intended to become a tank mechanic. He grew up in Detroit working on cars with his father at Sullivan's garage on Michigan Avenue. By age 16, he could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. By 18, he was rebuilding transmissions faster than mechanics with 20 years of experience. When the draft notice arrived in March 1943, Sullivan was 23 years old and managing his father's shop. The Army tested his mechanical aptitude and assigned him to the 3rd Armored Division as a motor pool mechanic. His job was keeping Sherman tanks running in combat conditions. Sullivan arrived at Fort Knox in May 1943 for tank maintenance training. The instructors taught him Army procedures: how to change tracks, how to service the radial engine, how to replace damaged components with identical parts from the depot. But Sullivan saw problems the instructors didn't mention. The Sherman 4A1 had a critical weakness that was killing American tank crews across Europe. The tank's transmission linkage system used cables to connect the driver's controls to the actual transmission mechanisms. Under combat stress, these cables stretched and loosened, creating a delay between the driver's input and the tank's response. That delay was usually less than half a second. In normal conditions it didn't matter, but in tank combat, half a second could mean the difference between life and death. When a Sherman driver tried to reverse quickly to escape enemy fire, the stretched cables created a pause before the tank actually moved. German tank crews learned to exploit this weakness. They would fire at the exact moment American tanks tried to retreat, knowing the Sherman would remain stationary just long enough for their round to hit. Sullivan first noticed this problem during training exercises at Fort Knox. Sherman tanks practicing emergency maneuvers seemed sluggish compared to their theoretical performance specifications. The drivers complained that their tanks felt mushy during rapid gear changes. Sullivan examined the cable systems on 3 different Sherman tanks. All showed signs of cable stretch. The steel cables were within Army specifications for tension, but they had lengthened slightly under repeated stress. That small amount of stretch created the delay that was getting American tankers killed. Sullivan mentioned this to his training sergeant, a man named Rodriguez who had served in North Africa with the 1st Armored Division. "Rodriguez, the transmission cables are too loose," Sullivan said. "They're creating response delays." Rodriguez examined Sullivan's evidence. He agreed there was a problem, but explained the Army's position. "The cables are within specifications," Rodriguez said. "Changing them requires engineering approval from Detroit Arsenal. That takes months. Besides, field modifications void the warranty." Sullivan asked what happened to tanks whose warranties were voided. Rodriguez laughed bitterly. "Same thing that happens to tanks with valid warranties. They get shot up by Germans." Sullivan realized the Army prioritized bureaucracy over effectiveness. Dead tank crews couldn't file warranty claims, but living bureaucrats could refuse unauthorized modifications. In August 1943, Sullivan shipped out to England with the 3rd Armored Division. The unit spent 3 months preparing for the invasion of Europe. Sullivan serviced Sherman tanks and listened to stories from mechanics who had worked on damaged tanks returning from Italy and North Africa. The stories were consistent. Sherman tanks performed well in most conditions, but they died in close-range engagements with German armor. The problem wasn't firepower or armor thickness. It was responsiveness. American tanks couldn't react quickly enough to changing tactical situations. Sullivan knew why. The cable stretch problem he had identified at Fort Knox was killing men in combat, but he was a sergeant in a motor pool. Nobody asked for his opinion on tank design. The 3rd Armored Division landed at Omaha Beach on June 23, 1944, 17 days after D-Day. Sullivan's job was maintaining tanks in forward repair areas, fixing battle damage, and keeping the division's Shermans operational. His first encounter with combat-damaged tanks confirmed his worst fears. On June 28, A Sherman from the 32nd Armor Regiment limped into Sullivan's repair area, with its right track damaged by German anti-tank fire. The tank commander, Lieutenant Robert Hayes, climbed out of the hatch shaking with rage and frustration. "This goddamn tank nearly got us all killed," Hayes said. "I tried to reverse when I saw the Panzer Faust, but there was this delay, like the tank didn't want to respond. By the time we started moving, the German had time to reload and fire again." Sullivan examined Hayes's tank. The transmission cables showed typical stretch patterns. He measured the cable tension and found it within Army specifications, but barely. "Lieutenant," Sullivan said, "your cables are loose. That's causing the delay you felt." Hayes stared at him. "Can you fix it?" Sullivan looked around the repair area. His commanding officer was busy with paperwork. The other mechanics were working on different tanks. "I can try something," Sullivan said. "But it's not regulation." Hayes grabbed Sullivan's arm. "Sergeant, I don't care if you paint the tank purple and hang fuzzy dice from the gun barrel, just make it respond faster." Sullivan opened his toolkit and pulled out a roll of field telephone wire, standard communications cable, designed to carry radio signals between command posts. It was strong, flexible, and exactly the right diameter for his purposes. He cut a 6-inch piece of wire and bent it into a small tensioning device. Then he installed it in the transmission cable system, creating additional tension that eliminated the stretch-induced delay. The modification took 8 minutes to complete. It added 2 pounds of tension to the cable system. It was completely invisible, unless someone examined the transmission linkage closely. Hayes test drove the modified Sherman around the repair area. The tank's response to control inputs was immediate and precise. "Jesus Christ," Hayes said after returning. "It's like a completely different tank. How did you do that?" Sullivan explained the physics of cable tension and response delays. Hayes listened intently, then asked the crucial question, "Can you do this to other tanks?" Sullivan nodded. "Any Sherman takes less than 10 minutes per tank." Hayes spread the word through his regiment. Within 3 days, Sullivan had modified 12 Sherman tanks. Each crew reported the same improvement: faster response times, more precise control, better survival in close combat. But Sullivan's modifications caught the attention of Captain Morris, the division's maintenance officer. Captain Morris inspected Sullivan's work on July 3, 1944. He found the wire tensioning devices and immediately recognized them as unauthorized modifications. "Sergeant Sullivan, what is this?" Morris demanded, pointing to the field telephone wire. Sullivan explained his solution to the cable stretch problem. Morris listened, then shook his head. "These modifications are not approved by Detroit Arsenal. They violate Army maintenance regulations. Remove them immediately." Sullivan protested. "Sir, the tank crews say these modifications are saving their lives." "Tank crews aren't engineers," Morris replied. "They don't understand the complex stresses involved in transmission systems. Your modifications could cause catastrophic failures. Men could die." Sullivan wanted to point out that men were already dying because of the original cable problem, but he held his tongue. Morris outranked him by 4 pay grades. "Remove the modifications, Sergeant. That's an order." Sullivan spent the next day removing his wire tensioning devices from 12 Sherman tanks. The tank crews were furious, but military discipline prevented them from openly defying Morris's orders. Lieutenant Hayes approached Sullivan privately that evening. "Sergeant, unofficially, can you reinstall those modifications?" Sullivan looked around carefully, then nodded. "Unofficially, yes. But if Captain Morris finds out, we're both in deep trouble." Hayes smiled. "Captain Morris spends most of his time at division headquarters. He only visits the motor pool once a week. What he doesn't know won't hurt him." Sullivan began secretly reinstalling his modifications during night shifts. He worked by flashlight, installing the wire tensioning devices after Morris had returned to headquarters for the evening. Within 2 weeks, Sullivan had secretly modified 18 Sherman tanks. The crews knew to hide the modifications during Morris's weekly inspections. But the real test came during the Normandy breakout operations in late July 1944. The 3rd Armored Division spearheaded Operation Cobra, the massive offensive that broke German resistance in western France. Sherman tanks with Sullivan's modifications performed significantly better than unmodified tanks during the high-intensity combat. Tank commanders reported faster reaction times during engagements with German armor. Crews survived encounters that should have been fatal because their tanks could reverse quickly when threatened. The division's after-action reports noted improved Sherman performance, but attributed it to better crew training and tactical coordination. Nobody mentioned field modifications by a sergeant from Detroit. Sullivan's secret spread through the division by word of mouth. Tank crews requested his services. Mechanics from other units asked him to explain his technique. By September 1944, Sullivan had modified over 60 Sherman tanks across multiple units. His wire tensioning system became known as the Sullivan Fix among tank crews, though it remained officially unauthorized. The 3rd Armored Division advanced across France and Belgium throughout the summer and fall of 1944. Sullivan's modified tanks consistently outperformed standard Shermans in combat situations requiring quick maneuvering. German tank crews began to notice that some American Sherman tanks responded faster than others. Intelligence reports from captured German documents mentioned improved American tank responsiveness but couldn't identify the cause. German engineers examined captured Sherman tanks but found no obvious modifications. Sullivan's wire tensioning devices looked like original equipment to anyone unfamiliar with Sherman tank specifications. The breakthrough came in November 1944, during the Battle of Hürtgen Forest. The 3rd Armored Division attacked German defensive positions in dense woodland terrain that favored defenders. Sherman tanks had to advance through narrow forest roads where German anti-tank weapons could engage them at close range. Sullivan's motor pool had moved forward to support the offensive. His repair area was only 2 miles behind the front lines, close enough to hear artillery fire and small arms combat. On November 15, 1944, German forces launched a counterattack against American positions in the forest. 8 German Panzer IV tanks broke through American infantry lines and advanced toward Sullivan's repair area. At 6:42 a.m., Sullivan was working under a damaged Sherman when the first German tank appeared through the morning fog. The German Panzer fired immediately. Its 75 mm shell struck the disabled Sherman that Sullivan had been repairing. The explosion knocked Sullivan unconscious for several seconds. When Sullivan regained consciousness, he saw 8 German tanks advancing in single file along the forest road. They were 400 yards away and closing quickly. Sullivan's repair area contained 4 operational Sherman tanks. All had been modified with his wire tensioning system. The tank crews were scattered around the area, some still sleeping, others working on maintenance tasks. Sullivan grabbed the nearest intercom radio and broadcast an emergency alert. German tanks approaching from the north. 8 Panzers, 400 yards and closing. All crews to your tanks immediately. The American tank crews reacted quickly. They had been in combat for 5 months and knew the sound of urgency in Sullivan's voice. Lieutenant Hayes reached his Sherman first. He was the most experienced tank commander in the unit and automatically assumed tactical command. Hayes keyed his radio. All tanks, this is Hayes. Form line abreast. Engage the leading German tanks. Use the Sullivan modifications to your advantage. Sullivan crouched behind a supply truck and watched the engagement unfold. The German tanks had tactical advantages. They outnumbered the Americans 8-4. They were advancing on prepared ground. Their crews were fresh and had not been fighting continuously for months. But the American tanks had Sullivan's modifications. Hayes engaged the lead German Panzer at 300 yards. His first shot missed, striking a tree beside the German tank. The Panzer returned fire immediately. The German shell passed over Hayes's turret by inches. Hayes needed to reverse quickly to find cover behind a large oak tree. In a standard Sherman, the reversal would have taken 2 seconds due to cable stretch delays. Hayes's modified tank responded in 1.2 seconds. The German gunner had calculated his second shot based on the expected delay. When Hayes's tank moved faster than anticipated, the German shell struck empty ground where the Sherman should have been. Hayes reversed behind the oak tree, then immediately shifted forward to engage from a different angle. The rapid gear changes that would have been impossible in an unmodified Sherman allowed him to confuse the German gunner. Hayes fired again. This time his shot struck the German Panzer's front armor, penetrating and exploding inside the tank. The Panzer stopped moving. Smoke poured from its turret. The other 3 American tank commanders had been watching Hayes's engagement. They understood how to use their modifications tactically. Lieutenant Morrison engaged the second German tank using rapid advance and retreat movements. His Sherman would advance to firing position, shoot, then reverse to cover before the German could respond effectively. The German crew couldn't predict Morrison's timing because they had never encountered Sherman tanks that responded so quickly to driver inputs. Morrison destroyed the 2nd Panzer with his 3rd shot. Lieutenant Wilson used a different approach. He engaged 2 German tanks simultaneously by rapidly shifting between firing positions. His modified transmission allowed him to change position fast enough to engage multiple targets before they could coordinate their return fire. Wilson destroyed 1 Panzer and damaged another before retreating to reload. The 4th American tank commander, Lieutenant Baker, used his modification to execute a flanking maneuver that should have been impossible for a Sherman tank. He reversed rapidly to break contact, then advanced along a parallel forest trail to attack the German tanks from their left side. Baker's unexpected angle of attack caught the German crews completely off guard. They had been focused on the frontal engagement and didn't notice his flanking movement until he opened fire from 200 yards. Baker destroyed 2 German tanks before the remaining Panzers realized they were being attacked from multiple directions. The entire engagement lasted 12 minutes. 4 modified Sherman tanks destroyed 6 German Panzers and damaged 2 others. The surviving German tanks retreated back through the forest. American casualties, 0. German casualties, at least 24 tank crew members killed or wounded. Sullivan watched the entire battle from behind his supply truck. He saw his wire tensioning modifications save the lives of 16 American tank crew members and destroy 6 German tanks. But he also realized that his secret was about to become very public. Division headquarters would investigate this engagement. They would interview the tank crews. They would examine the tanks to determine why American Shermans had suddenly become so effective against German armor. Captain Morris would learn about the unauthorized modifications. Sullivan would face court-martial for violating Army regulations. But Lieutenant Hayes had different ideas. Hayes approached Sullivan after the battle and shook his hand. "Sergeant, your modifications just saved our lives and won this engagement. I'm recommending you for the Bronze Star." Sullivan shook his head. "Lieutenant, when division headquarters investigates this, they're going to find the wire tensioning devices. Captain Morris will have me court-martialed." Hayes smiled. "Not if Captain Morris never finds out about the modifications." Hayes explained his plan. The tank crews would tell investigators that their improved performance came from intensive training in rapid maneuvering tactics. They would claim that months of combat experience had taught them how to get maximum responsiveness from their tanks. The modifications would remain secret. Sullivan would avoid court-martial. The tank crews would get credit for tactical innovation. But Hayes had a bigger plan. "Sergeant, I'm being rotated back to the States next month for instructor duty. I'm going to teach Sherman tank tactics at Fort Knox. I want you to come with me as a technical advisor." Sullivan was confused. "Lieutenant, I'm a motor pool mechanic. What would I teach?" "You'll teach other mechanics how to install your wire tensioning system. Unofficially, of course. We'll call it advanced maintenance procedures or field optimization techniques." Hayes continued. "The Army will never officially approve your modifications. Too much bureaucracy, too much liability. But if we can teach the modifications to mechanics at the training base, they'll spread throughout the entire tank corps." Sullivan realized Hayes was proposing to institutionalize his unauthorized innovation through informal channels. 3 weeks later, Sullivan received orders transferring him to Fort Knox as a technical instructor. Captain Morris signed the transfer papers without comment. He was probably happy to get rid of a troublesome mechanic who asked too many questions. Sullivan arrived at Fort Knox in December 1944. His official job was teaching advanced Sherman maintenance procedures to new mechanics. His unofficial job was teaching the Sullivan fix to every mechanic who would listen. Sullivan trained 127 mechanics between December 1944 and April 1945. Each learned how to install wire tensioning devices in Sherman tank transmission systems. The mechanics graduated and shipped out to tank units across Europe and the Pacific. They carried Sullivan's modification with them. By March 1945, an estimated 400 Sherman tanks had been secretly modified with Sullivan's wire tensioning system. Tank crews reported improved performance, but attributed it to experience and training rather than mechanical modifications. German intelligence continued to note improved American tank responsiveness, but could never identify the cause. Captured American tanks showed no obvious modifications. The war in Europe ended in May 1945 before German engineers could solve the mystery. After the war, the U.S. Army conducted detailed studies of Sherman tank performance. Statistical analysis showed that some Sherman tanks had performed significantly better than others in identical combat situations. The Army attributed the performance differences to crew experience, tactical doctrine, and leadership quality. The possibility of unauthorized mechanical modifications was never seriously investigated. Sullivan remained at Fort Knox until his discharge in November 1945. He returned to Detroit and reopened his father's garage. He never spoke publicly about his wire tensioning system. When veterans asked him about his war service, he said he was a mechanic who fixed tanks, nothing more. In 1963, a military historian researching Sherman tank modifications found references to improved transmission responsiveness in several unit after-action reports from 1944 to 1945. The historian contacted Sullivan and asked about field modifications to Sherman tanks. Sullivan confirmed that he had developed a wire tensioning system that improved transmission response time. He estimated that his modifications had been installed on at least 400 tanks by war's end. The historian asked why the Army had never officially adopted Sullivan's modification. Sullivan laughed. "The Army doesn't adopt solutions from sergeants. They adopt solutions from colonels and contractors. My solution worked, but it didn't come through proper channels." The historian published a paper about informal innovation in military organizations, using Sullivan's story as a case study. The paper was read by about 50 academics and filed away in university libraries. Michael Sullivan died in 1987 at age 67. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press mentioned his distinguished service as a tank mechanic in World War II. It did not mention that his unauthorized modification had saved hundreds of American lives and improved the effectiveness of the Sherman tank. His garage on Michigan Avenue closed after his death. The building was demolished in 1991 to make room for a parking lot. But Sullivan's legacy lived on in the memories of tank crews who had survived the war because their Shermans responded faster than German crews expected. Lieutenant Hayes, who had protected Sullivan from court-martial and arranged his transfer to Fort Knox, became a career Army officer. He retired as a colonel in 1965 and spent his retirement years writing about tank tactics and the importance of field innovation. In his memoirs published in 1978, Hayes wrote, "The best military innovations often come from enlisted men who see problems that officers don't notice." Technical Sergeant Mike Sullivan saved more American lives with a piece of field telephone wire than most generals saved with entire battle plans. Hayes died in 1994. At his funeral, several World War II veterans approached his family to tell them about a mechanic who had modified their tanks and saved their lives. The veterans didn't remember Sullivan's name. They called him that sergeant from Detroit or the guy with the wire trick. But they remembered that his modification had made their tanks faster, more responsive, and more likely to bring them home alive. Today, the principle behind Sullivan's modification is standard engineering practice in modern military vehicles. Electronic systems have replaced mechanical cables, but the concept remains the same: eliminate delays between operator input and vehicle response. Modern tank designers study World War II after-action reports to understand how field modifications improved combat effectiveness. Sullivan's wire tensioning system is cited as an example of successful battlefield innovation. But the Army's official history of Sherman tank development makes no mention of Technical Sergeant Mike Sullivan or his unauthorized modification. The bureaucracy that tried to stop him in 1944 erased him from the record books after the war. Yet the Sullivan fix lives on in every modern military vehicle designed for rapid response and maximum crew survivability. Sometimes the best engineering comes not from corporate design teams or military contractors, but from a sergeant in a motor pool who sees a problem and figures out how to fix it with whatever materials are available. Michael Sullivan never received official recognition for his contribution to American victory in World War II, but the tank crews who survived because of his modification knew the truth. One piece of field telephone wire, properly installed, could mean the difference between life and death. That's innovation. That's what wins wars.